I want to get into what I call the corruption of the word special, which has allowed everyone to enter in and use basically that specialness, quote unquote, as a status symbol. So to get to the bottom of what I'm calling the quote unquote specialness trend, that's kind of what I'm delving into with really all of this. So the specialness trend really comes from where specialness comes from generally. So there is such a thing as special people, and this is not special needs people. This is not, obviously that's a category of people, but that's not what I'm referring to specifically in this nature. So specialness, uniqueness, individuality. So I want to take us back to a bit of a history lesson. So for those who don't know, a guy named Alexis de Tocqueville, he was a French sociologist who came over to the United States to study a prison system in the early 1800s. This is about a little after the War of 1812, so this is kind of after America really began to establish itself as a major superpower. We had just beaten the British again in a world war, LOL, kind of, but that's kind of how it works. And so de Tocqueville comes over, and he wants to study the prison system, and he wants to do this, big white paper and say like, okay, this, that, whatever. And he ends up traveling across the entire country. And now we had spread beyond the 13 colonies by this point. We had gone into some of the South. So we had gotten into the Midwestern territories, the Great Lakes, Ohio, Tennessee, Kentucky, all of these other things that are kind of getting, carved out. And so de Tocqueville goes around the United States for, I think, about a year, if I remember correctly. I think about a year. And he writes down all of his observations, and he writes probably the biggest and most groundbreaking sociology book ever recorded in history, which is called Democracy in America. And so de Tocqueville is a Frenchman, like I said before, and so he only knew the French way about doing things in the French culture. He knew about European culture broadly, but he really didn't know anything about America, and not a lot of people in the world knew much about America at that point. So what de Tocqueville discovered, and what was his primary focus inside of his study, was that the way that we form individual and communal cultures is very, very different from Britain. And so what he noticed about America is that individualism took a much bigger precedent in America than it did inside of Europe. So basically what he thought was interesting about America is that they were able to form communities out of individualism. And he thought the flaw of Europe largely was they had a lot of communal culture, of conformist culture, because they were a class-based society in a lot of ways. They came from feudalism, all those type of things. And they couldn't really form a lot of individuality out of those things. Their entrepreneurship rates, even if you look at this now, the entrepreneurship rate in America is far exceeding every single European country. The influencers that come from, around the world are far higher in America than in Europe. And that's for a reason. And that reason is a cultural reason. So what de Tocqueville discovered was that the individualism that he discovered was that people generally conformed around institutions. And so that is kind of where he all lends his credibility to. So for example, the reason you are what you are is because you form a set of roles that you do. Ben Shapiro has a really good analogy from this. So he tells us the tombstone analogy. So when you go to someone's grave inside of any graveyard, you'll probably see a couple of buzzwords that are used across many tombstones. So for a man, you might see beloved husband, devoted father, great employee, phenomenal boss, whatever. And all of those things are written on your tombstone or written in your eulogy because those are the roles that you filled inside of society. So I will use myself as an example of me conforming around the institutions that society created. And this is the kind of the tension that de Tocqueville talked about between institutions and between the actual person. So for me, I am a brother, I'm a son, I'm a Christian, I'm an author, I'm a podcaster, I'm a YouTuber, I'm a seller, I'm an entrepreneur. And so I am Sam Lacrosse because I am an amalgamation of all of those things. And so that is why I have an identity, because I am defined. That's part of the word identity, define. That is a word, a part of the word that is used in that scenario. I am defined as Sam Lacrosse because I am all of those things plus more. I am more than those institutions, but primarily I am driven because of those institutions. They drive my work, they drive my value system, they drive my beliefs, they drive my relationships, they drive everything that I read, everything that I listen to is largely because of those institutions that I have conformed myself around. But that has begun to erode itself, which is why we're getting this culture of narcissism, which is where I go next. So if you remember the subtitle, autism, narcissism, obscurity, social justice, and then disabled. So we track from the autism piece where we talk largely about autism. I talk a ton about that inside of the book. If you're ever interested in the history of autism, I try to chronology it the best I can inside of that video, or give a chronology of the legacy of autism in many ways. And I try to do that inside of the book. And that was really fascinating for me just because my sister is autistic and I was curious about it. So, but then we lead into narcissism because we get this rise in terms of this entitled sense of individualism, which is very different from de Tocqueville's individualism. And when you look back at how this happened and how this transition happened, you find three people, at least from my studies, that are really, really critical to see how individualism got warped from something that was like de Tocqueville's analogy and observation in Democracy in America to now where we have this culture of narcissism where everyone is so individualistic that they're stepping and crushing everybody who does not conform or affirm their individualism, to use a better word for it. So the first person that is essential to study in this is Robert Bellah. So Robert Bellah is arguably the greatest sociologist that America has ever produced. He's a titan in the field of sociology. He died a couple years ago, and he lived a very, very long life. He wrote a ton of books. He did a ton of research. He did a lot of things. But the biggest thing that Robert Bellah contributed to the field of sociology was a book in 1985 called Habits of the Heart. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. It's kind of a nerdy book. It's an academic book, which is why I liked it, and I had to read it for this because I was doing a lot of research inside of this. So Robert Bellah in that book studied American communities, a lot like de Tocqueville. He was very influenced by de Tocqueville. He was very influenced by, I believe, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who did the social contract theory, everything like that. And so what Bellah's contribution to this was that kind of kicked over this domino that manifests fully in our culture today is the term expressive individualism. So after Bellah did the study of Habits of the Heart, where he went across American communities and talked to people in various parts of the world and saw how they lived and saw how they communed with other people, he studied de Tocqueville, like I said, he studied Rousseau, he studied all these people. And so he developed this term expressive individualism, which essentially inverted de Tocqueville's definition of individualism. So remember, de Tocqueville's definition was, you are a person because you conform around a set of institutions. So again, I am Sam Lacrosse because I am a son, brother, Christian, etc. But what Bellah saw happening was that individualism was getting corroded into something that was the opposite of that. So what Bellah said, what the definition of expressive individualism is essentially, is that you are, or the institutions are the institutions that they are because you are a specific person. If you are a top-performing, high-earning man in a corporate job, I have a free gift for you, the Value Economist Handbook. In this book, you will find a bulletproof, crystal clear, and step-by-step roadmap to build your values, systematize them into an unbeatable portfolio, and leverage them to create an unshakable identity that leads to fulfillment, meaning, and purpose. So, if you want a free copy, go down to the description below, fill out your information, and we'll send one over to you right away. Now, let's get back to today's video. So you are the defining thing that the institutions all have to orient around. And if anyone corrects itself on that or tries to correct itself on that, they are threatening your identity at your core and they need to be destroyed because if you don't have your identity, you don't have anything. So let me invert that from an expressive individualism perspective. So my name is Sam Lacrosse and I determine what a son, brother, Christian, entrepreneur, podcaster, author, etc. is because I am Sam Lacrosse. And Bellah's contention was that this is incredibly destabilizing, this is dangerous, and he wanted to make sure that it didn't spread, because think about it. So I know a lot of sons, and you know a lot of sons. So what if my definition for what a son is based off of me in the expressive individualist context rubs up against someone else's definition? What if they have a same-sex household that they grew up in? What if they have raised by a single mother? What if they were abused? What if they were molested? What if they were all these things? And people have different definitions for a lot of those things. And in an expressive individualist context, they take issue with that and use it to kind of pour salt on your definition and set it on fire. That's a problem. That's a very big problem. And unfortunately, what Bellah saw is that it's manifesting to everything inside of our culture. It's growing and spreading like weeds across our entire culture, which leads to a person who really looked up to and admires Bellah's work, Charles Taylor, who is a Canadian philosopher who connected this to the death of religion and the secularization of society. So what he saw with Bellah's expressive individualism was that this was the movement that was going to ultimately replace religion. So we saw society abandoning Christianity, abandoning, going to church, abandoning social fabric, etc. And he said the religious influence in people and the religious impulse in people is not just going to go away and die. It's not going to happen. But what he did say is it's going to transmutate into something else, which became expressive individualism. So essentially, people are becoming their own gods. And this is exactly in the line with what Robert Bellah said. Because what Robert Bellah said was that you can self-determine every institution in society because you are an expressive individualist. You are expressing your individuality. You're forcing it onto our institutions. And so Charles Taylor said, okay, that makes a lot of sense. And also, I'm going to think that this is going to replace the individualism is going to become so pronounced. The individual is going to be so pedestalized at the end of the day that it's ultimately going to get to that standpoint very, very quickly. So that's a major problem, because when people begin to believe that they are gods and they go to war against other godlike figures, quote unquote, inside of this context, that is a major, 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 major problem. A major problem. So Carl Trueman is the final leg of the stool. And I believe that Carl Trueman, so go back to another Ben Shapiro analogy here. So Ben Shapiro, apparently, I don't know if this is true or not, but Ben Shapiro, on average, reads about 5 books a week. That's what he said. And I think Ben is tremendously smart. I don't agree with Ben on everything. I just, did an episode a couple weeks ago where I dumped all over his company. But that's I respect Ben quite a bit for a lot of his opinions, even though I don't agree with him on everything. And I think he's an objectively intelligent and smart person. So Ben reads 5 books a week. So if you multiply that out roughly over about 10 years, that is about 2,000 books that Ben has read in the last 10 years. When he was on Lex Fridman's show a couple years ago, he said that Carl Trueman's book, what I'm going to discuss, was the best book he has read in 10 years. That's a pretty big statement coming from Ben Shapiro, not only because he's intelligent objectively, but because of the sample size. It is the best book out of more than 2,000 books that he's read in 10 years. So I was like, whoa, I got to go and get this book and see what this is about. And that book was The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman, who's a theologian. He teaches at a bunch of colleges, and he's been to seminaries and a bunch of other things. I didn't know nothing about Carl Trueman before Ben brought up his name. So what Trueman did was connect the ideas of Charles Taylor and Robert Bellah to the tether of identity, and showed why it was eroding not just what people thought, but everything else around it as well. And I think really when you boil it down, this might sound like a hyperbolic statement. I promise you that it's not. So Trueman's thesis explains everything about the way that our world is inverting on itself, because everything comes back to narcissism, which is why so many people have individualized their narcissism so much. And so what Trueman said was that this was getting the expressive individualism was now no longer a theory, a academic work. It was no longer anything like that. It was so core to so many people that it was going to be an identity-based principle. It was at your center of yourself. That is what your identity eventually led to. And that's why everyone is going crazy. And so that begs the question about, okay, well, if it was just an academic theory, if it's just something a bunch of nerds talked about, which really, no disrespect to Carl Trueman or Robert Bellah or Charles Taylor, but they're all kind of nerds. They're all, stuffy academic type people. So how did this get so mainstream? Why are we seeing this across so many other people? And to that, I turn to 2 people, Drew Pinsky, aka Dr. Drew, and Gene Twenge. So Dr. Drew was noticing a democratization of narcissism. He wrote a great book, one of the best books I've ever read in my life, called that's Gene Twenge's book, called The Mirror Effect. He wrote it in the mid-2000s when reality television was getting big. This is when Britney Spears was melting down, Anna Nicole Smith, all those big things. This is like right before Miley Cyrus kind of blew up and Demi Lovato kind of blew up before our eyes and spontaneously combusted, sort of. But essentially, they saw narcissism getting democratized from celebrity to everyday people, which is now spreading in expressive individualism like a virus. So what Dr. Drew saw was that it initially was spreading through reality television, because they saw when Britney Spears was shaving her head on MTV and Anna Nicole Smith was marrying some 90-year-old oil executive and Miley Cyrus is, twerking on the TV with a bunch of chickens, whatever. He saw that people were mimicking this and posting this online in the early days of social media. And he said, oh boy, this is not good at all. And he was an addiction therapist and he treated Steve-O, he treated a bunch of other people. And so then the iPhone comes out. And that really took this up a notch. And that's what Gene Twenge saw with the narcissism epidemic, which he wrote a great book on and wrote a great book called iGen. So now the mirror effect, which is basically everyday people thinking that they are celebrities when they're actually not, and mirroring celebrities, which is why it's called the mirror effect, was now jacked up on steroids, HGH, and brain-fed to every single person with a smartphone in their hand, which now just flooded the market with narcissism. So basically, this is how this all spread. And this is why this inner narcissism was enabled into a lot of other people.